don't know about you, but I managed to get a holiday this year. I was very lucky. I got it when the sun was still shining in July. And I had probably a mini midlife crisis. Probably a bit late for a midlife crisis, but hey, if I live to be 120. I fancy getting a tattoo. Okay. So there was me. I was up in the northeast. I was following the way of St Cuthbert's. It's a walking trail all the way from Melrose and the Scottish borders to Holy Island. It's a distance of about, what is it? 80 kilometres, something like that. It always sounds better in kilometres. So I was thinking about all these Celtic saints like Cuthbert and Aidan and all the rest of them. And, you know, I've always been happy to have Celtic roots. My mother is Welsh. And I just fancied getting a little tattoo of some Celtic knotwork. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to show you. I hope you can see some of this. Whether you're here in the playground or online. This is what they call a triquetra. It's like a trinity in knotwork. And there's a Celtic cross there on somebody's wrist. That's another triquetra. And here you've got another Celtic cross with a Bible verse, John 8:32, which I believe is something from the story of the woman caught in adultery, and Jesus saying, "Go and sin no more," something like that. So, yeah, I thought, ooh, I really fancy getting a tattoo. Thought it'd be great. So where's your tattoo? You're wondering. I never did it. I thought, I looked into it, and they're quite expensive, and I probably wouldn't be able to sit still for that long. And anyway, I don't like pain. So I haven't got a tattoo, sorry. Now, I'm not advocating tattoos for everybody. Parents, rest easy. I didn't even let my eldest have a piercing until he was 18. So, but has anybody got a tattoo? Anybody admit to having one? Of any kind? You got one? Where is it? Okay. Can you tell us what it's of?
It's the pilgrim shell and the cross of St James.
Oh, right, yeah. Oh, St James, of course. From the Camino. Yeah. Fantastic. A pilgrim shell, a scallop shell of St James. Fantastic. Okay. So I wonder, if you had a tattoo, I wonder if what you would choose, whether it would be something pretty, or something with a message, or a symbol, or maybe some words. If you're online, maybe you could drop something into the comments and let us know. So, tattoos are interesting things. When I was growing up, my mother didn't like tattoos. She said they were vulgar. The only people, when I was growing up, back in the 60s, who had tattoos were sailors and rough people. Things have changed a lot. But you know, tattoos, they can be pieces of art, or they can have a message, they can be symbolic. People who have a tattoo might get a tattoo to express a deep devotion to somebody or something. Maybe the girlfriend, maybe the wife, maybe the husband, maybe the children. Or it might be some symbol that they belong to some group or tribe, or some elite group or mafia, turned to more sinister ideas. In some cultures, getting a tattoo at puberty signifies transition into a new stage of life, into adulthood. So, tattoos. Any thoughts about tattoos? Anybody want to talk to me about it? Yeah? What would you get?
Portraits of people.
Can somebody tell me what?
Portraits of people. Portraits of people.
Portraits of people. People that you love. Fabulous. Fabulous. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Now the thing about tattoos, and I was talking about this with Amy before the service, the thing about tattoos is they're permanent. They literally get under your skin and become part of your body. They won't wash off or fade away like henna does eventually. So you have to be really sure you want one. And you have to be really sure it's the one you want, because it won't wash off and you can't get rid of it easily. Now, why am I talking about tattoos? You see, in our reading from the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah says that God will write on a part of our body. God will write on a part of our body. God will write on our hearts. Not literally, but like a tattoo, whatever God writes on the hearts of his people will not fade, will not disappear, will not wash off. So what does God want to write on the hearts of his people? Is anybody paying attention? God said through the prophet Jeremiah that he will write his law on the hearts of his people. God will write his law. What, like the Constitution? Like the laws of the land? Not really. So let's just spend a few moments looking at what's going on when Jeremiah says these words to the people of God. Jeremiah is saying more than writing law on people's hearts. Jeremiah is saying something very profound about the relationship of God with his people, which is taking a turn that they were not expecting. As always, the Bible is relevant today. I don't know what you know about the prophet Jeremiah and how much you've read of him. Well worth a read, but a bit depressing in places, I have to say. Back when I was younger, people used to talk about a Jeremiah, somebody who prophesied doom. We're doomed. Jeremiah didn't mince his words. Jeremiah was the one that was often prophesying bad news of judgment on God's people. And naturally enough, the people didn't want to hear prophecies of bad news. They wanted to hear comforting words. Don't we all want to hear comforting words from God? But Jeremiah had a message to give from God, and it was a message of judgment because the people had gone astray. But slap bang in the middle of all the gloom and doom, right in the middle of Jeremiah, there are 3 chapters that are not doom and gloom and judgment. Chapters 29 to 31 are about comfort and about hope. And these chapters are addressed to people in exile. They're in exile because they've done wrong. They've disobeyed God. They've gone away from God's commandments. You'll be familiar with Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. It's a very comforting verse. We heard it a few weeks ago when the youth chose it as one of their readings. Jeremiah 29, verse 11, God says, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. Beautiful words. And that's set in 3 beautiful chapters. The judgment hasn't gone away. Jeremiah's not saying the judgment doesn't matter, but Jeremiah is saying that God still loves you. You are still God's people. He will not abandon you. So these chapters, they're in the form of a letter written to the exiles of the Jewish people. Refugees, we all know about refugees. In our Deanery Synod this week, we had a presentation by a charity called Care for Calais, who is caring for the hundreds, actually, of refugees that are here in Newham, living in hotels and other accommodation. So, you know, this is real stuff. This is God talking to refugees and exiles, giving them hope. Like I said, it directly addresses the punishment that God gave them for disobedience. It doesn't take any of that lightly. But it promises restoration in the future. Over and over again in these chapters, God repeats the same phrase. You know what that phrase is? You will be my people, and I will be your God. That's in chapter 30, verse 22. I will be the God of the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. Chapter 31, verse 1. And then in the passage we read, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. What a beautiful promise for exiles, for refugees, for people who have lost everything, to be told that they belong. For people who've lost their homes, their families, are questioning their very identity as a people. Now, I have never experienced this profound loss that's known by a conquered people, by an oppressed people. But I know that some of you have. Some of you can't go home, much as you love to, for fear of persecution. How beautiful must it be then to be told by God that you have a home in God, that you belong, that you are God's people forever. So that's the context. Our passage in Jeremiah talks about an old covenant. He says there's an old covenant, but this is a new covenant, different from the old one. So what was the old covenant? The old covenant was very simple. I will be your God, and you will be my people, and you must obey my laws. And there were a lot of laws. Whole books of the Old Testament of them, so much of the books of Moses, is laws for the people of Israel. Laws that regulated their behaviour towards each other, towards God, and towards worship. Obedience led to a blessing, a material blessing of prosperity, beautiful homes, wealth, fertility, lots of children. Disobedience brought a curse. Loss of home and wealth, infertility, drought. These are the things that Moses said that were in store for God's people if they didn't keep his laws. You know, to try and keep the people faithful to the laws, the Jews were even told to write the laws down on their doorposts and their gates, and to tie them to their foreheads and to their wrists. You can still see that. If you see Orthodox Jews, they've got these little boxes tied to their foreheads. That is the law of Moses, part of it at least. There in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 8, it tells the people to do this, to write the laws on the doorposts, on the gates, tie them to your foreheads and to your wrists, so that you and your children will not forget to obey the laws. But they did disobey, didn't they? They forgot God's goodness. They worshipped false gods. And they didn't obey every commandment. How is it even possible to obey every commandment? I don't. Do you? It's not possible. See, trying to do the right thing when your heart isn't right, it's a bit like trying on clothes that don't belong to you. When you were children, did you dress up in mum's high heels? Ladies or gents? You know, if you're putting on somebody else's shoes, sooner or later you're going to stumble and fall, and you're going to kick them off in disgust because they're not part of you. There's something alien, they don't belong. Or maybe it's like those temporary tattoos. I don't know whether you had those. When I was a kid, we had these temporary tattoos that you used to rub on. And then after a while, they'd start rubbing off and looking tatty, and then you'd wash them off and think, well, that's the end of that. And it's as if they were never there. But we're not children. And God doesn't want to treat his people like little children. God wants something permanent in us. Permanent change. And God promises to a people that went astray and paid the price that things are going to change. He's going to make it so that you don't have to remember every little rule that was put in place, because they'll be a part of you. You won't need teachers to teach you the law, because it'll be deep within you, written on your heart, based on a deep friendship with the God who made you. I mentioned the law earlier. It's not like the laws of the land, okay? God's laws or commandments were rules to be followed by a people set apart from other nations. That's what Israel was, a people set apart to be a role model, if you like, for the world. And as I said, there were hundreds of laws, some of them quite complex to carry out, a lot of them very inconvenient, but all there for a purpose. And in essence, they boiled down to an outworking even, of just two principles. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. That's the first one. That's the one on which everything else is based on. Secondly, you know what's coming. You shall love your neighbour as you love yourself. If that sounds familiar, it's the summary of the law that Jesus gave us in the Gospels. Jesus, who came from God and who is God, who had those laws written in his heart, because he is love. God in a human body. Love in human form. That's Jesus. The Jesus that we follow. Now I love that in the C of E, we carry on the tradition of reading from the Gospels every Sunday in the communion service. Because it's there that we find Jesus. It's there that we find the transforming effect Jesus had on people who wanted to change. People who knew their need of God. Now, if you're on the church WhatsApp group, you'll know that I've been banging on about this drama series called The Chosen. I don't know whether any of you have had a look. There's still time. It still exists. Look at it on YouTube if you don't want to download the app straight away. Just have a look, see what you think. It's called The Chosen. And it's a really interesting view of the Gospels because it gives the people who followed Jesus a backstory, if you like. It's not stuff that's based directly on the Gospels, although the Gospels is there, and the things that Jesus said and did is there. But it fills in the gaps, if you like, between what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John said, and kind of reads between the lines. Maybe you won't like it. That's okay. I love it. It's really gripping stuff, actually. You probably know that the first disciples were fishermen. But what did that mean? To have their livelihood based on the sea and the weather and what they could get in the market for their wares. You may not have twigged that one of the disciples that Jesus called was a tax collector. Matthew, the same Matthew that wrote the famous gospel that the Sermon of the Mount and all the other stuff is in, with the Beatitudes, that Matthew was a tax collector. He had a whole other life before he met Jesus. Collecting taxes for these Romans who'd come in as an imperialist force with their soldiers, not quite with their tanks, but with their chariots. And he was handling tainted money. He was set apart not by his holiness, oh no, but because he was despised as a traitor. There's a great depiction of Matthew in The Chosen, but I'm not going to say any more. Spoilers. I just love Matthew in The Chosen. But let me say this. The man that's talked about in our gospel today, he was a tax collector too. Zacchaeus. Not just a tax collector, but a chief tax collector. He supervised all the others, making a lot of money out of his own people, taking a cut himself, of course, and handing it to this imperialist power. He would have been seen as the corrupt leader of a corrupt industry. Imagine him, with his big gold rings and his big gold chains, and his fancy embroidered silks. What could we compare him to? Kingpin drug dealer, maybe? making his fortune out of the desperation of addicts and people in poverty. Or a sleazy member of the government, handing out business contracts to friends in exchange for, they might not call it a bribe, they might call it a donation. In my book it's a bribe, but that's enough about them. Zacchaeus, the leader of a corrupt group of people. I would love to know Zacchaeus' backstory, and why it was that he was so desperate to see Jesus on that day when he was passing through. So desperate to see Jesus that he hitched up his robes and tucked them into his knickers and climbed up a tree. How dignified is that? But he wanted to see Jesus better. Why? I don't know. Sometimes we don't even know ourselves why we do the things we do. I didn't know why it was that on a November evening in 1979, when a pair of Christian women knocked on my door of my halls of residence in Salford University, that I invited them in to talk about Jesus. Because I had no idea why it was that this Jesus died on a cross and what it meant for me. But for some reason, I was curious. And I'd never set foot in a church. Never. Believe me when I say I had never set foot in a church. Or maybe when I was 3 and my cousin got married. I never knew what church was. Didn't really understand about Jesus. Didn't know one end of the Bible from the other, and it made no sense to me. It really didn't. But I ended up agreeing to meet those two women every week and to read portions of the Bible in between time and think about some questions that they'd set and some thoughts that they wanted to leave with me. But you know what? I ended up being changed. After a few months of this, I gave my life to Jesus. God was in it all. You remember last week we read that story about a shepherd whose sheep got lost on a hillside, and the shepherd left all the other sheep to go and look for that one sheep and bring it back rejoicing. God could see that in my own way I was lost, and he was calling me. I didn't recognise it, but he was calling me and giving me a hunger to know him and a sense that my life was about to be changed forever. In that same way, Zacchaeus had a hunger for God. Whether he knew it or not, God was calling him to come home. And Jesus saw this in him when he looked up into that tree and said, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today. So when Jesus said this to him, Zach didn't hesitate. He knew his life had to change. God was already giving him a new heart, just as the prophet Jeremiah had promised hundreds of years before. He knew that he had to change. I don't think that it was a response to the criticism of others. Okay? There were people who didn't believe that Jesus should be spending time with a man like Zacchaeus, a corrupt man, a corrupt leader of corrupt people. And so they criticised Jesus, and they couldn't believe that Zach could be anything. I don't think it was that made Zacchaeus say what he said when he was treating Jesus to dinner at his house. Remember, he told Jesus he was giving up his corrupt and cynical ways. He was giving back 4 times the amount that he cheated people out of. And he was giving half of his possessions to the poor. You imagine how rich he must be to be able to do that and still have plenty for himself. Wow. It was because God had written his law on his heart. God gave Zacchaeus a new heart with his law written in it. And Jesus could see this. And Jesus responded by telling all around them that salvation had come to Zacchaeus and his house that day. And what's more, pronouncing him a son of Abraham, a true Israelite. This man that nobody saw as an Israelite anymore. He was a traitor. He was a son of Abraham, a true Israelite. He was that sheep that was lost from the flock. He was that one that belonged to God, but God went after him because he wanted him back with the rest and brought home. He was no longer an outcast, but a beloved member of God's family. That's what God wants for everyone, not just for Zacchaeus, not just for me, not just for all of you, but for everyone out there. So like I said, on the 6th of February 1980, I gave my life to Jesus. I was 19 years old. And I told him that I would follow him to the best of my ability and trust him to take me in the right direction. Lots of things happened since then. But let me tell you something that I remembered when I was preparing this sermon. A few months later, I went back to my childhood home of Birmingham, because you do that when you're a student. And I was in a church and I heard a man praying. He was one of the elders of the church, a man I looked up to. He was twice my age. He'd been a Christian probably all his life. And he was saying this. He was saying, Lord, my heart is like a stone. I can't follow you the way I want to. I mess things up. I need your help. Please help me. And I looked up at him and I thought, oh no. But then some words came into my mind. And I wish I'd had the courage to say what I didn't say that was in my mind at the moment, that God put there. I didn't have the courage. I felt intimidated by him. But these were the words that came to me. Someone who didn't know one end of the Bible from another. Found out later they were the words from the prophet Ezekiel, who was around at the same time among the exiles, the same time as Jeremiah. And these were those words from Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 26 and 27. A new heart I will give you, says the Lord, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove from you the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and make you follow my laws. Those are the words God gave me to a man who just said his heart was like a stone. This is the promise of God to anyone who puts their trust in Jesus, who knows they need to change. Not the promise of prosperity for obedience, but something far more precious. The promise of belonging to God's family, if you only allow God to write his love on your heart. I'm not going to say much more. I think that's enough. You see, with God's love written indelibly on our hearts, permanently, there are no limits to the good we can do in the world. And there's no end to the goodness of God's love upon us.